Now that we've done a little bit to characterize the nature of inductive inference, let's turn our attention to judgment heuristics for inductive inference. We'll start off by looking at these general heuristics first by exploring their origins again. Then we'll look at the representativeness heuristic, the availability heuristic, the affect heuristic, anchoring and adjustment, confirmation bias, belief perseverance, and the backfire effect. So this is Daniel Kahneman, and I'll use him to some extent as a spokesperson for this material since he did win the Nobel Prize for this and other work. Judgment heuristics are principles or methods by which one makes assessments or judgments about the world and how to act therein. So for example, he and Tversky are famous for their formulation of judgment heuristics for estimating probability simpliciter. Judgment heuristics aren't consciously used or monitored. Though often useful, they sometimes lead to systematic errors, and this is particularly true when the conditions in which they were employed vary dramatically from the conditions under which they evolved. So what sort of conditions are relevant when we think about our inductive inference strategies? Well, the basic capacities and innate dispositions that drive human inference probably evolved during that hunter-gatherer phase of human and proto-human evolution, anywhere from 4.4 to 7 million years. Only about the last 12,000 of which wasn't hunter-gatherer existence. At that time, humans are making inferences in environments that are relatively small, maybe 30 miles from their place of birth, relatively stable, there's little change during their relatively brief lifetime, and relatively homogeneous. And this turns out to be really important for inductive inferences because it means that these hunter-gatherers' experiences are likely to mirror the environment fairly well, and that's important for induction. When we think about inductive inference, we're thinking about the representativeness relationship holding between a sample and a population. And as Tversky and Kahneman describe it, representativeness is an assessment of the degree of correspondence between a sample and a population, an instance in a category, an act and an actor, or more generally between an outcome and a model. Thus, for them, representativeness provides the basis for statistical inference in that it uses the presence of properties and relations within a sample to infer those properties and relations in the population. Now, statistical inference proves reliable because it operates by collecting and analyzing samples so that the dimensions and degrees of representativeness between the sample and the population are stable in their variation. That is, the sample corresponds to the population along known parameters and to known degrees. So when we think about statistical inference, we know that our statistician is going to go to the population that he wants to make an inference about, and he's going to carefully select a sample from that population. He's going to try and select it randomly. He's going to try and select a sample that's reasonably large, and he's going to measure the properties in that sample in a way that's as methodologically unbiased, as unlikely to introduce error as he possibly or she possibly can. From that sample, then our statistician will make an inference to the frequency of those properties in the population, again, introducing a margin of error so that error that still, despite his best efforts, may have occurred in the sample is accounted for in the inference from the sample frequency to the population frequency. Thereby, statisticians will always formulate a hypothesis that specifies a range of possible values, never a single value. The basis of statistical inference, as we now have repeatedly emphasized, is this well-known representativeness relationship between randomly selected, reasonably large, and methodologically unbiased samples and the populations from which they're sampled. We can look at an example of this from when Obama signed the Dreamers Act. Shortly thereafter, they did a poll. The poll sampled 1,003 people, a reasonably large sample that is selected at random, and it got data that it measured using as objective as possible measurement tools, saying that 56% felt that Obama's action on immigration should go forward and not be blocked. So 56% was the ratio of people who felt it should go forward in that population, in that sample. When the statisticians made an inference from that sample to the population, they made the inference that the frequency in the population of people who thought the action should go forward was 56 minus 3, or 52.5, to 56 plus 3.5, or 59.5. They said with a 95% probability, it will fall within the range of 52.5 to 59.5. That was a modern statistical inference based on well-known representativeness relationships between a randomly selected, reasonably large, and methodologically unbiased sample and the population from which that sample was drawn. The representativeness heuristic uses a relationship between samples and populations as well. The representativeness heuristic infers the probability of properties and/or relations in the population on the basis of the representativeness of those properties and/or relations to and within one's own internally represented concepts and schemas. For example, suppose that I tell you that I own a bird, and I ask you what the probabilities are for the bird being a parrot, a parakeet, or a starling. You're likely to give me estimates of probability based on how typical that type of pet bird is given your concept of pet birds, how representative it is of your experiences of pet birds. So we can think about the representativeness heuristic as operating as follows. The representativeness heuristic, when it needs to make an inference, it pulls up a sample, but it pulls up a general purpose sample, a schema or a concept, one of these executive summaries of its experiences. It doesn't go out and get a sample from the population it's interested in. It doesn't have, or hunter-gatherers didn't have the time or the resources to make those kinds of inferences. Instead, they did the best with what they could. They needed a tractable solution. They had to get her done. So, representativeness pulls up your concept. It measures the frequency. How does it do that? And how typical is this of my concept or my schema? Is this a typical instance of my concept? A typical instance of my schema? How typical is this of pet birds? That's its frequency. Typicality becomes frequency. Frequency of the sample gets extrapolated to the approximate frequency in the population. The more typical something is of your concept, the more frequent it is in your experiences, hence the more frequent it should be in the population. The less typical, the less common, the less frequent in the population. So we can see that the representativeness heuristic really has sort of three basic assumptions that it needs to hold in order for it to work. First of all, it has to assume a high degree of representativeness between the concept and the schema and the population. It also has to assume that that representativeness isn't just a sort of general representativeness, but it actually includes information that's appropriate to the particular inference that it's looking for. So if I'm making an inference about pet birds of Wallace, it needs to be representative in a way that reflects pet birds of Wallace. Finally, it's going to measure frequency in the sample by judging typicality, translating typicality into frequency and experience, translating frequency in my sample to frequency in the population, approximate values. More typicality, more sample frequency, more population frequency. Less typicality, less sample frequency, less population frequency. Let's look at that in the specific case of pet birds. So I ask you to make an estimate of what's more likely, a parrot, a parakeet, or a starling. You pull up your concept of pet birds, there's your sample. You measure frequency in the sample by judging typicality. Parrots or parakeets are probably the most typical. Starlings, pretty low on the list. Therefore, they're highly likely in your sample, very common in your sample. Starlings are very low in your sample. So you make an extrapolation. High typicality, high frequency in sample, high frequency in population. Again, we have those three assumptions. An assumption of a high degree of representativeness of your pet concept with respect to the specific population that you're thinking about, pets I might own. Assumption that the pet concept includes adequate information regarding my pets to support an inference about my likely pets. Again. And finally, that measurement assumption, high typicality equals high sample frequency equals high population frequency, low typicality equals low sample frequency equals low population frequency.